Teal dear, something interesting to consider today, and somewhat a follow-up, but also a prequel to a couple of other videos. Not all that long ago, you may recall that I did a video looking at the conformity to masculine norms index and the conformity to feminine norms index, and how the method by which these academic feminist approaches to analyzing masculine behavior were born out of a process which can basically be described as complete pseudoscience. And in that video, I took a very brief look at some of the questions or statements that they would ask the participants to determine how much or how little they conform to a certain kind of behavior. And how, despite the fact that there are a few subtle changes in the language in the questions, they are fundamentally still examining the same basic pattern of behavior, but they use a few little tricks to try and make it appear as if they are looking at something else, such as by reversing the scales on which they measure it. For example, on the masculine norms index, they said they were measuring someone's propensity for playboy behavior, as in a man's likelihood to take multiple sexual partners, but for a woman they referred to it as sexual fidelity, and they did so by basically reversing the scale. So instead of looking at likelihood to take multiple partners, they would look at likelihood to take fewer partners. Now, this is actually looking at the exact same pattern of behavior when you consider the fact that it's being measured on a scale that goes from -2 to 2. -2 on the masculine scale would be less sexual partners, +2 would be more, whereas on the female scale, -2 would be more sexual partners, +2 would indicate fewer. Ultimately, they were testing for the same pattern of behavior, but by reversing the scale, they could then load the language in which they present it, and this then results in a bias of reporting. And one of the other things which I was more interested in looking at was the specific phrasing of the questions, because how you phrase a question and the words that you pick can affect the answers that people are likely to give. And this is where this video being a bit of a prequel comes in. We've covered the sequel part, now let's cover the prequel. I want to do another video in the coming weeks where I actually look through the lists of questions or statements that they asked people whether or not they agreed or disagreed with. And I want to hopefully look at how they've loaded the language in some of those questions to begin indicating to people how exactly they've biased the results, not only from doing some of their sneaky little trickery by reversing scales, but also in how they have chosen to persuade people to give certain answers by loading the questions with certain language choices. And this finally brings me on to what I want to talk about today, because when you load language in such a way, when you change the definitions of words by altering the context around them, this is a process which is called persuasive redefinition. And I wanted to do a little bit of further reading on this subject before going into it. And when I was doing a Google book search on this, a short section from a book titled Critical Thinking was thrown up at me in the results. Now, this is a short section, it's only 3 paragraphs long, but the final example of persuasive redefinition in this really stood out to me, because it put me very much in mind of what we've seen social justice types and feminists doing in recent times, with their ever-creeping definitions of terms surrounding the political right wing. And I'm sure you know what I mean by this, where you see anyone who is a supporter of social justice or modern intersectional feminism, when they are disagreed with or when something happens that they don't like, they will often hand-wave it away as someone simply being right-wing or conservative or alt-right or neo-reactionary, or even fascist, even when that person's views have absolutely nothing to do with those political leanings at all. They will simply apply that label and then use that as an excuse to ignore that person, because they have judged them to be one of the unclean, filthy peasants who are morally inferior to them and thus not worthy of contact. And it was this book's specific reference to the persuasive redefinition of the term fascist that really stood out to me. Once again, I'm sure you all remember Lacey Greene's rather epic coin flip of a personality after the results of the recent 2016 presidential elections in the USA. So I'm just going to read this through for you now, and hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I did. Persuasive redefinition. An especially effective device in changing attitudes is what is called persuasive redefinition. the redefinition of a familiar term or phrase that has both a descriptive and evaluative meaning in such a way as to change its descriptive meaning while keeping its evaluative meaning the same. Consider the term poet. The dictionary gives as one definition of a poet a writer of verse. This gives the term's descriptive meaning. The word can also be used with a strong positive evaluative meaning. To describe someone as a poet is normally to praise him or her. If we wanted to capitalize on this evaluative meaning, we might try a persuasive redefinition that involves dropping the requirement that a poet actually has to write verse. A poet is a person with a deep and vivid imagination. Given this definition, we could describe someone as a poet, and hence praiseworthy, who has never actually written a poem. If we are challenged, we could claim that we are not using the word in its original or vulgar sense, according to which anybody who can scribble a rhyme would count as a poet, but rather in the true sense of the term. The essence of being a poet, we might say, is having a deep and vivid imagination. In other words, we attempt to justify shifting the descriptive meaning by claiming that our new definition is superior because it is truer. In fact, of course, such definitions are not usually superior at all, but only different, and, if judged as reportive definitions, wildly inaccurate. To be effective, a persuasive redefinition must not change the descriptive meaning too much, or else the audience will see the trick and not be fooled by it. If someone tried to redefine the term intelligence to mean the ability to use words of more than 2 syllables, no one would take the attempt seriously. But where the change preserves some of the original descriptive meaning, it may be harder to detect. A definition of intelligence as the ability to perform mental calculations quickly is closer to the original descriptive meaning, and hence could be more successful as a persuasive redefinition. People who are good at doing mental calculations might well want to redefine intelligence in this way in order to attract the admiration that intelligence usually evokes. Persuasive redefinitions are always stipulative, since the new descriptive meaning always differs from the original descriptive meaning to a certain extent. What distinguishes a persuasive definition from an ordinary stipulative definition is its purpose, for it always seeks to retain the original evaluative meaning. Most stipulative definitions are indifferent to the evaluative meaning of the term. To illustrate the process of persuasive redefinition, let us consider an historical example. In the 1920s, the term fascist came into use as a name for a political movement in Italy. It was strongly nationalistic and anti-communist, and placed great emphasis on the role of a leader in expressing the spirit of the people and furthering the traditional values of the society. Similar movements in Germany and elsewhere also came to be referred to as fascist. Originally, the term lacked any clear evaluative meaning. People in many countries considered fascism as a serious political alternative, and many well-meaning people adopted a number of fascist views. The events of World War II, however, gave the term a strongly negative evaluative meaning. With the defeat of fascist regimes in Germany and Italy, one might have expected the term to fall into disuse. In fact, it has become an accepted part of our political vocabulary, probably because a number of influential political writers wanted to preserve it as a term of abuse. To do so, however, its original descriptive meaning had to be revised to take account of the fact that the original fascist movements no longer existed, and it now refers to any government with totalitarian or racist policies. The original descriptive meaning has largely, although not entirely, disappeared. And here endeth the reading. So I'm sure you can see what I mean about that last paragraph about fascism. That really stuck in my mind. Especially since, as a political term for the vast majority of history, it has simply meant a political system, often with one leader, and a fairly strong sense of either nationalism or general protectionism in trade. And these sorts of systems, as with any political system of government, has strengths and weaknesses. It can situationally be a good way of governing a country, and it can situationally be a bad way of governing a country. But as this book has pointed out, in the last 100 years, its definition has shifted quite a way away from what it originally meant, to now basically be a term used for people who harbor racist views, even though racism is not a necessary part of fascism. After all, you can be a fascist who would have nationalist leanings without hating people of other races, and yet points like this are conveniently forgotten by those of the regressive left, or simply never known in the first place, since they have only ever been using the persuasively redefined definition of the term. And this happens to their entire vocabulary, especially to any word referring to anything in the political right wing. This is why you will often see them using terms such as reactionary, neo-reactionary, alt-right, conservative, fascist. All of these words to them are basically interchangeable because they are nothing more than snarl words that have had their definitions changed and shifted so many times that they basically now mean the same thing, which is simply anyone who disagrees with me. All the differences in point of view between all of these political camps are totally lost, which is why you can hilariously find people on the regressive left referring to supporters of Donald Trump as fascists, even though the overwhelming majority of these people fully support the democratic process, despite the fact that it's one of the core tenets of fascism that liberal democracy is obsolete, since fascism tends to prefer a one-party state, with the mantle of leadership often being passed by a system of merit rather than by a system of popular opinion, from people who have no formal training and no life experience in the role of political leadership. So as you can see, when you know what the term fascist actually entails, the idea of referring to someone who fully supports democracy as a fascist becomes laughable, but not after a century of persuasive redefinition of the term. And this line of thought is why we see feminists and social justice warriors so eager to control language, so eager to dictate what words mean and how we should use them. Because once you have total control over language, you're then able to completely obliterate certain topics, certain thoughts, and certain points of view, because they are no longer able to actually be spoken about, because the language that you would use to do so doesn't exist anymore. Now, in that situation, you would simply create new terms. But then, once again, these people would come in and attempt to redefine those terms. And thus the cycle goes ever on. Anyway, I just found that rather interesting. Hopefully you found it interesting as well, and it's given you a little bit of food for thought.